Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organisation defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. There is more information on the website womensdeclaration.com, where you will find our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, which has been signed by 32,003 people from 159 countries and is supported by 450 organisations. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contacts, engaged in defending women's rights. This week, I'm really pleased to say that we have Lexi Ellingsworth from the UK. She's from the Surrogacy and a co-founder of Surrogacy Law Reform in the UK, co-founder of Stop Surrogacy Now UK. And she will talk about surrogacy law reform in the UK. Second, we will have Sue England, who is from the UK, and she will talk about freedom of assembly. And she is a lawyer and will talk about some of the legal aspects and the implications for freedom of assembly. Then we will hear from Dora Moutot, is a book writer, journalist, radical feminist activist and influencer, and is going to talk about Femellisme, which is feminism for females. And it's fantastic to have you with us, Dora. Thank you so much for coming. And then we're going to run a pre-recorded video talk from Sal Grover from Australia, who is the founder of Giggle, a women-only social media space. And she will tell us about what's happening, that a case taken against her by a man who said he's a woman wanting to be included on her on her social media space has been dropped, and she'll tell us about that. So we're going to go now to Lexi Ellingsworth. She is, along with her co-founder, Liz, Lexi launched Stop Surrogacy Now UK, a grassroots organisation to challenge surrogacy law reform, which is currently being proposed in the UK. They hope to raise awareness of the other side of surrogacy and share the stories of women with surrogacy regret. So thank you so much, Lexi, and over to you.
I'm Lexi Ellingsworth. I'm the co-founder of Stop Surrogacy Now UK. Those are our contact details, just for you to note down if you'd want to be in touch with us. Just to explain a little bit, first of all, to explain about how we sort of came into being. As I said earlier, myself and my co-founder Liz met on a parenting forum where we were discussing surrogacy law reform and the Law Commission's public consultation. And based on the concerns that we had, I did a freedom of information request to establish who was involved in the design of the consultation. And that was quite a long period of time, from from August 2019 until July 2020. And we were concerned about the likely bias coming from the pro-surrogacy lobbyists, such as the surrogacy agencies, the lawyers and the fertility clinics. And we decided to launch a single issue grassroots campaign to challenge the proposals that were made clear in the consultation documents. We formed Stop Surrogacy Now UK in August 2020. We also launched a discussion group on Facebook, which now has 200 members. And rather reluctantly, I joined Twitter with the campaign in August 2021. And you can find us at Wombs Not For Rent. So the law as we are now, the surrogate mother is the legal mother at birth. A parental order transfers parental rights, and advertising surrogacy services is currently banned. Essentially, by changing the current model from the one we have now to one with a pre-birth agreement, which grants parental rights to the commissioning parents at birth, we're shifting to a commercial model. There is a clear issue of ownership and how this can, and we feel will, influence the pregnancy, the body autonomy and the decision-making power of the surrogate mother. Because if you own the baby inside the woman's body, how much of her body and her choices do you own too? We feel that I need to ask, does this shift the arrangement from trust and friendship, which is a narrative that is consistently promoted by surrogacy agencies, to one of property and ownership? And then also by lifting the ban on advertising, will women be encouraged to sign up as surrogate mothers? We consider this a potential issue when it's put into the context of the cost of living crisis following years of austerity, and now we're living in a post-COVID Britain. There are wealthy women who become surrogate mothers, but if we lift the ban on advertising, and would it appeal to capture single mothers, students, and any other women who are looking to feed their children? So that's one of our concerns. So moving on to our list of concerns is really going over that again, the removal of the legal rights of the surrogate mother at birth. There is no set age of women to be surrogate mothers, but basically in the Brazier report, which I'll get onto a bit later on, it was from 21, and that would be looking to have it to begin at 18 years old. And then there's a general lack of limits, of upper age limits, numbers of pregnancies, etc. I'm just going to spend some time on this because it's quite important, really. We believe that the transfer of parental rights at birth will take us to a more commercial style surrogacy model here in the UK. Currently, the transfer of parental rights takes place via a parental order process, which can be applied for within 6 months after the birth. And it's approved by a judge, but it's a fait accompli, really, as the baby is already in the custody of the commissioning parents from birth, and they are the primary carers. Even the level of expenses rarely raises an eyebrow. So the system largely secures the transfer of parental rights, of legal parental rights, to suit all parties involved, and the 6 months allows for a cooling off period. It's claimed that the current system causes issues around medical decisions, and there's a problem with the automatic parental rights of the surrogate mother's spouse. But medical decisions can be made by the commissioning parents with the approval of the surrogate mother. And there is actually a form that can be completed by the surrogate mother's husband if he wants to relinquish parental rights during the pregnancy. So we don't really see a justification for this change, as there's only a handful of cases have been proven to be challenged in court. There's one recent case, actually. I'm going to ask Liz, if she's on the line, to drop that into the chat. But there was a relationship breakdown between the surrogate mother, her husband on one side, and then the commissioning parents on the other. And it undermines this narrative of the friendship first that's being pushed by surrogacy agencies. There's no one can legally force a friendship between different adults, and this recent case does underline this. It was a recent case ruled by the European Court of Human Rights in May, so just earlier this year, and it kept the mother's name and the name of her husband on the birth certificate of the little girl who she gave birth to and who was commissioned by 2 men. The child arrangement order means the daughter is legally required to have contact with her mother. As we were saying, the minimum age recommended by the Brazier report, which looked at surrogacy law in the UK in 1998, it was for women to be surrogate mothers from 21 years old. And some surrogate agencies set this as their minimum requirement. But the Law Commission suggests that 18 years is the age limit, be the minimum. So to align with legal adulthood, that would be the same for the minimum age for intended parents as well. But this opens up a whole new group of women available for surrogacy, which is a plus for surrogacy agencies, but not so for the women of that age, due to an increase in likelihood for maternal death. And you can look at the statistics on that from Embrace. These women are only just adults in the eyes of the law. They can be extremely vulnerable and may later regret their involvement in surrogacy. It has not been proposed that a woman engaging in surrogacy must have experienced pregnancy and birth, so she cannot give informed consent. And it's conceivable that she could be giving up her first and possibly only child, possibly to a couple who are in their later years, because there was a CAFCAS study of parental orders in 2013 to 2014, so just for 1 year, and it recorded the oldest intended parent at 66 years old. Examples given to the Law Commission included a commissioning mother in her 60s and a commissioning father in his 70s. And so given the obvious likelihood of a surrogate-born child to an older couple being orphaned before reaching adulthood, it was surprising to us that the Law Commission did not propose any did not introduce any statutory age limits on commissioning parents. And finally, there's no limit proposed for the number of surrogacy pregnancies you can have. Serial surrogacy, as I call it, is quite rare, but the obstetric risks are obvious. Despite this, a conversation that we had with the Human Fertility Embryology Authority, which is HFEA, we spoke to them once, and it can be summed up as saying that they said, we do not limit how many children you can have for yourself, so we should not limit how many you want to have for others. That was essentially the gist of the conversation. Surrogate mothers have spoken on the addictive nature of surrogacy and how it gives them an almost drug-induced high. So with this in mind, it seems sensible to limit how many times you can do it, but there was no suggestion of this and no regard for safeguarding in the consultation. My Freedom of Information requests revealed that surrogacy lawyers and surrogacy agencies from both in the UK and abroad were involved in the design of the consultation. The replies also confirmed that Stonewall was involved, and there was a deliberate focus on gay press in their media plans. So just looking at this extract here, this is highlighted text from the Law Commission. These aren't my highlights. There was also general coverage in the national media, such as BBC and national newspapers, but no women's media was sought out. And I thought that unusual because actually women's magazines have historically been sympathetic and encouraging of surrogacy. So we thought that was an interesting point to make on the Freedom of Information request. This is a list of women's organisations who were approached. They were invited to participate before the launch of the consultation, the public consultation, but it was only after the public consultation closed that feminist organisations were approached. The Freedom of Information request also showed that there were meetings with the Department of Education, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and with surrogate mothers, but just one voice of an adult born of surrogacy was consulted. I would like to make a point about expenses, because I do think this is actually quite key to whether this is, we have altruistic surrogacy or whether it's considered commercial in the UK. A 2015 study from the University of Kent in 2015 stressed that surrogacy in the UK should not be transactional. It uses terms like compensation and being recompensed. In this survey, there was just over a quarter of respondents were surrogate mothers, and among their concerns was a clear desire for surrogacy to remain non-commercial. And one male partner of a surrogate mother indicated that his belief was that money taints the surrogacy relationship. So if we look in more detail at the expenses here, you can see this is actually an extract from the Law Commission's public consultation, and you can see the list of what they include as pregnancy-related items. As I said, the 1998 Brazier report said that surrogate mothers should not be paid in excess of reasonable level of actual expenses incurred as a result of the pregnancy, but they should be paid for out-of-pocket expenses, and this can include anything from petrol and parking for say hospital scans and appointments to a loss of earnings. But it also included to a flat rate of compensation for loss of fallopian tubes or hysterectomy. And looking at this list of what could be included as a claimed expense, I'm wondering whether is food a pregnancy expense or is it a basic cost of life? And is rent an expense relating to a surrogacy pregnancy, or is that just something that we, have to pay for if we have a rent or mortgage to pay? And then lastly, is a post-birth holiday for the surrogate mother and her family an out-of-pocket expense? I think it's a bit of a grey area. So in terms of what you can do to support us, if you'd like to support us and get involved, you can find us on Twitter or email us from our contacts page on our website. There are also actions on the website, and one of the most recent ones is relating to the special committee in Ireland, and they're looking at legalising international surrogacy. International surrogacy is almost entirely commercial, so this is quite a concern for us, and we've been looking at that in some detail and moving our focus away from UK reform for that purpose, because that report actually was released the day before yesterday. It was on the 7th. I'm happy to take some questions if we have time, but before doing so, I'd like to pose some. I'd like to ask, what does surrogacy tell us about how we value women? What does it say about our society, which legitimizes the sale of children? And if the market has already been created, can we ask ourselves, where does this lead? Quite astounding sometimes how it's not limited by age. I would say that there's a range of, so it's young women, but then there's obviously sort of women more in their 40s, and they think that ultimately if a woman wants to have a baby and give a baby away, that's her right to do so. And I think it just immediately ignores whether the child has any rights. It's just ultimately that the child, which is absolutely at the center of all surrogacy arrangements, right? Like, it's obviously, that's the reason why this is happening, is to produce a child at the end. But that child is not almost considered human. They're not kind of considered a whole person with rights of their own. So it is rather interesting that in the younger generations that there would be, first of all, I find it interesting that there's a comparison between abortion and surrogacy, because I find them to be totally opposite things. I mean, they are literally quite the opposite. One of them is terminating a pregnancy, so a child is not born, so that fetus doesn't grow and become a baby and be born. And the other one is almost, in my mind, it's like a planned adoption, because you're literally deliberately getting pregnant in order to give that child to somebody who is not the mother, so to remove the child from the mother. And it's the opposite of an abortion, of a termination of a pregnancy. So it's very interesting when those two things are compared. And then it's also quite interesting when the younger generations see them as both under human rights. And then if you see them under human rights, then you neglect to see that the child has human rights. And we do have the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which does have an article in there about identity, which isn't in the terms that we put it in now with self-ID and gender ideology. It's actually under the identity of nationality and having your knowing your family and knowing your genetic roots. And something that's very interesting in this area is genealogical bewilderment, which we know is evident in children who've been adopted, who obviously in adults who know about the fact that where their circumstances of their birth, not knowing their genetic connections as they grow up. And also it's evident in children who are donor conceived. And there's no such studies on this on surrogate born children, but of course, if you're donor conceived and surrogate born, you could be likely to develop or experience genealogical bewilderment. So there's a whole range of things that are actually connected to this. But I think in terms of the younger generation, I think it is a lot to do with social media. I think it's a lot to do with media and the stories that are told, and how the narrative around surrogacy is that it's all, lovely and happy, and there's no one actually, it shows, obviously the other side of it, as we've talked about, and that's the side that we see. So when we speak to women who've been surrogate mothers and they have regret over their decisions, or perhaps they haven't been treated so well by the commissioning parents. I mean, this case that I mentioned, and the link in the chat, obviously there was a reason why that relationship broke down, and that was the relationship between the surrogate mother, her husband, and the commissioning parents, who are both two men. And there isn't any detail in that particular article about what happened, but why is it that relationship broke down? It's not all happy, smooth sailing, unfortunately, and it can be rare, but obviously it does happen, and it's those cases that we want to highlight and raise awareness of.
If you know about the research on the damage to the baby of this early separation,
I can't see that one in particular, but so there are studies, obviously the attachment theory. John Bowlby is someone I would recommend reading about. So attachment theory has been studied and well known, and I mean, in fact, we don't know that much about the fourth trimester as we experience it, which is the first 3 months of a child's life. But there are studies, but ultimately you can't actually conduct an ethical study because you can't create a control group. And the reason why you can't do that is because you can't ethically separate a baby from its mother deliberately on purpose to study for the purposes of actually, and then returning that child to compare it to a group where they're not being returned to their mother. I mean, I have personal experience of a friend of mine who was totally fine. She returned from labour, and they went home, and then she had to go into emergency surgery. And the child was separated from her mother for, I think it was 12 hours, and she screamed constantly to the point where it was obviously dangerous for her own life. She was, brand new baby, screaming at the top of her lungs. And the moment she was returned to her mother, just her mother's smell comforted her. It's something that, even though I don't feel that we need to study it, I think that we know it. I think that it's quite simple, in the same way that we know what a man is, we know what a woman is. There are some things that we just know. We don't need to study them in great detail. We know that children should be with their mothers. Brand new babies should be with their mothers. And we separate children from their mothers only under extreme examples, extreme situations where there's a danger to the child for their health or their well-being. And it's just not possible for that family to be together for whatever reason that might be. We don't do it for any other reason. And I don't know why we would consider it to be acceptable in society or as a practice, because it's surrogacy, because somebody has paid money or has paid some expenses. There's no other reason why we would do it. So that brings the whole question of surrogacy out into the sunlight, really, and we need to discuss it and be able to challenge the reform that's coming.
So we're going to now move on to Sue England. Sue England is from the UK. She's a lawyer, regular Feminist Question Time speaker. She's an expert on international human rights law and part of the Women's Declaration International Laws Committee and many other skills and attributes, but I'll leave it there. And Sue England is going to talk to us about freedom of assembly. So thank you so much, Sue, and over to you.
So here we are, freedom of speech and assembly in the UK and in the European Convention of Human Rights. So this was built around the UK, but the UK is in the Council of Europe, the 46 countries in the Council of Europe. So this is all the same stuff for people in those countries. At the same time, it all comes from the UN Declaration on Human Rights too. So in fact, it covers all countries in the UN. So those people who are outside the UK, don't go away. You can apply this stuff in any country that you are too. And we're going to look at the most fundamental and essential principles.
Everyone has the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and to freedom of association with others.
So this is what's in all the human rights documents, okay? Particularly this Council of Europe document, but it's in the UN document. You should find something exactly the same in your own constitution, wherever you are in the world. And the point about this is absolutely fundamental, because if you're going to operate a democracy, you have to have freedom of speech, you have to have exchange of information, you have to be able to be in contact with others about your ideas. So that's freedom of speech and expression, but also we all know throughout the ages, this also means that people have to have the right to demonstrate on the streets, but also to meet up with others, to hold meetings, to contact one another. So this is freedom of association, freedom of assembly in these slightly technical terms. We're assembling here today, even though we're all over the world. We're having an assembly. We are associating freely with others as we choose, and that's what it's all about. And it's absolutely fundamental to running any democracy. So that is an almost absolute right, in that everybody has it at all times, in all places. And the limitations on it, restrictions here, are very, very limited. So they should only be, as they say, prescribed by law. But that means if there are going to be any limitations in your country, they have to be put in law, they have to be democratically decided, they have to be available for you to access and understand. You need to know exactly where you are on all this. And next, those laws can only be made if there are necessary restrictions in a democratic society, okay? And here we've got the European ones, but it's the same in the UN. Well, if it was necessary for national security, public safety, maybe some huge demonstration, you know, where you're just simply frightened for people's safety, for preventing disorder or crime, okay, but these rules are very, very tightly limited, protecting health, morals, and also protecting the rights and freedoms of others. But in this context, everybody has the right to speak. So you can only go a very short way with that, talking about the rights and freedoms of others. They can talk themselves, they can assemble themselves somewhere else on a different occasion. They can't interfere with you. So this is Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So throughout Europe, you'll find something very similar in your own constitutions. And in Britain in particular, it's also embedded in the Human Rights Act, okay? So as soon as you see writing about these things, you'll be finding this. These cases are decided in British courts, but also then the controlling court is in Strasbourg, the European Court of Human Rights, which the previous speakers already mentioned, okay? This is a fundamental right in a democratic society, and it must not be interpreted by the police, by your politicians, by your courts restrictively. Any limitation should be as limited as possible. It covers private meetings, it covers meetings in public places. They can be static, you can have processions, etc. And of course, do not forget, we are assembling now, we're associating now. You can do all this online as well. And so it covers the participants, and it also covers the people who are actually organizing this assembly, this gathering as well, whether it's online or in the streets or in a meeting place. The convention is a living instrument, and these principles are broad principles. So you don't have to worry about, well, what were they talking about 20 years ago? It applies today in modern life, in circumstances now. So here are a few examples, some traditional in a sense, some new, but we have a case here about a flash mob in Russia recently protected, gatherings at private cafes, bi-communal meetings, meaning sort of, in this sense, groups between different communities, cultural gatherings, they're covered by assembly as well, this right to assemble, religious and spiritual meetings, press conferences, processions, a sit-in where there was a protest going on, and in fact also a protest outside a courthouse, for example, where people were protesting about what was going on inside. Anything, it's all covered, even if it's something new, like a flash mob. You have the right then, obviously, because you're free to associate and make meetings with anybody you like, to choose the time, the place, and as they call it, the modalities of the assembly. You can decide where you want to meet. You can decide the time, etc. You may, if you want some police protection, want to sort of negotiate it with them, but that's you are free to do that. No state can tell you where you're going to meet or at what time or whatever, except in the most limited circumstances where they're trying to, for example, protect public safety. It only protects peaceful assembly. So where organizers or participants have got violent intentions, and you can show that what they then incite violence, or they are going so far as to reject the foundations of the democratic society, that does allow limitations. But as we've all seen, with Maya Forstatter, there's an awful lot of talked about, damaging the foundations of a democratic society. That's almost impossible. That's almost impossible barrier, as it were, to reach. For most purposes, a democratic society has to run on freedom of speech and assembly in all circumstances, often in in every place. Okay, so at the bottom, the next couple of sentences, so you can only interfere as the state if it's necessary in a democratic society. If you've got a real legitimate aim, like public safety, something like that, and there is a pressing social need. And if there is any interference, you will be going to the courts, and they will look at this very, very toughly indeed and say, how can you possibly in these circumstances be justifying people not talking to one another, not exchanging information, not being free to gather together with who they choose? So during a rally, if they try and disperse you or arrest you, that's an interference in your right to have peaceful assembly. Obviously, here I am thinking about actual meetings, because if it's peaceful, it's allowed. As long as it's peaceful, it's allowed. And then also the state is not allowed to take other restrictions against you, to try and shut down these freedoms, which would be, for example, doing things before the assembly, after the assembly, which of course are really intended to intimidate you or frighten you, stop you in the first place, or then later on give you the idea later on that you'd better not do that again, because now life is going to get tough for you, or there are going to be punitive measures taken against you. They cannot do that. You have this absolute right to assemble peacefully. And also, when obviously there's maybe a difference between, say, public safety requirements or restrictions, and then sometimes restrictions based on the content of what this assembly is going to be about. Well, those things, content-based restrictions, are subject to even greater scrutiny than restrictions which might be about a technical nature. For example, how are we going to safeguard people? How are we going to get large numbers of people in and out of a space, safely, things like that. If they're beginning to start to talk about what you want to talk about, no way. No, that's going to be really strictly construed, because you would be having to do something which is threatening violence, or indeed sort of, talking about ending democracy, for example. So, and they also comment, it's very rare to legitimately bar any organization when you're conveying a message, when you're sort of attacking the message that these people, for example, us, are giving, especially where the main target of the criticism is the authority which is trying to stop you. In other words, if you're the government or the police or politicians or other groups, well, obviously they will try and shut you down. This is a no-no. Well, as soon as you're criticizing another powerful group or the government, that's the very reason that you should have this right to free assembly, and it can't be interfered with. And this the same thing, preventing disorder, that's got to be interpreted very, very narrowly by the police, by the government, anybody who is trying to put restrictions. It doesn't matter what your national government calls these meetings or these demonstrations. That's irrelevant. They've got no control over that. It's a really fundamental, wide-ranging idea, assembling in any way, in any place, using any media, etc. What they call it is completely irrelevant. Once, for us, the UK court or the court in Strasbourg says it's a demonstration within the scope of protection, you are peacefully assembling and you're peacefully talking to one another and communicating between yourselves or with the outside world, it is covered by this protection. So obviously, in the light of the events that we saw in Britain recently, the Bristol event, about which there is now an excellent video. And I didn't have time to get the link. So if anybody wants to put it up on chat, that would be very helpful, okay? But we have the Bristol event run by Posey Parker, which is now about 4 weeks ago. And then we have the event in Nottingham, which was a booked event because it was going to take place, in this case, inside a library run by Nottingham City Council. So let's think about very quickly about the practicalities of these two events. And obviously here, in the first case, the state, the government is not trying to stop this meeting. It was taking place outside in Bristol. What was happening was opposing forces were trying to shut it down. And to a certain extent, they did, because of, drowning out the voices of the women who were speaking, simply using other noise, and also being there and milling around, making sure that, in fact, the women in many cases were not able to stand where they wanted to. And so the problem was that the police were actually there, but they didn't tackle these limitations that were then being forced on these women by the opposing group. Now, that was clearly against the law. If there are opposing groups, they are not allowed to shut down other groups' freedom of assembly, which obviously they were trying to do. And it's up to the government to make sure that doesn't happen. Every group should be able to freely and fully assemble. And the police there, the British government, representing the British government, did not do that. Those other people were perfectly free to counter-demonstrate if they wanted to, but not to an extent that was interfering with the other group. So this is we have to bear this in mind always, and we have to understand these fundamental principles. And there has to be much more, for example, in the UK, pressure on the police over this. You are to keep these groups separate. And for example, you should not be allowing noise to interrupt the first assembly, the women, because that means they are not fully using their right of assembly. And then in the other case, obviously what happened here was there was a direct interference by the state. The public authority, Nottingham City Council, because then they decided to cancel it on the basis of what those women, what they thought the women were going to talk about. This is completely illegal. Unless they had evidence that the people at that meeting were intending to incite violence or to be violent, I don't know, running around the library, beating up small children, I don't know. They have absolutely no right to interfere with this meeting. Those people there are assembling and they are free to say what they want. And you can't challenge this meeting on that basis. And then you certainly can't stop it and say you are not free, to choose your time and place of where you are to meet. So from what I saw over the past couple of weeks now, I suppose it's a couple of weeks since that event, there is definitely going to be legal proceedings about that, because everything that the council did was wrong. And I'm sure that they are crowdfunding for it, I'm pretty sure, okay? So we must pursue that case. And there may also be a case against the Bristol event as well. But then finally, that's why we are working on now setting these principles out and in more detail for everybody. So hopefully very soon you'll be able to get from WDI I don't know what it's going to be, 3 or 4 pages maybe, which will explain to you what your rights are in an assembly and what the police should be doing and shouldn't be doing, etc., etc., etc. So we can start actually operating these rights in practice. Some people who've been on other demonstrations, for example, may have received similar training from other organizations. There is quite a lot written about this, but it is because we're seeing this complete breach of human rights, we must make sure that we ourselves get tooled up, read up, and if we go to any of these things, we have a much clearer idea of what our rights are before we get there.
We're going to go on to speak to Dora Moutot, and Dora Moutot is a French feminist, radical feminist. She's a book writer, journalist, activist, and influencer. She's followed on her personal account on Instagram by 80,000 people and has another profile or work about female sexuality that has a following of 500,000 people. She's published 2 books, one about living with a chronic digestive disease, à fleur de peau, and more recent one, Mal Baiser, about female sexuality under patriarchy. The first question I have is, how did you become a radical feminist activist, and how did you realize the trans movement is a threat to our sex-based rights?
So I think I started as a liberal feminist, like a lot of young women. And what happened is that I created this page called Tajwi about female sexuality, and I kept talking about like female organs basically. And after 2 years, suddenly a trans activist, they spotted me and they started teaching me how I should talk. So they told me like, oh, you're not inclusive enough. You need to talk about us trans women. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that because I don't consider you as a woman and I'm only talking about females, because for me, it was always very clear that I was just going to talk about that. And they started being super, super aggressive. And they told me I was a TERF. I had no idea what a TERF was. I was like, what the fuck? I'm gonna Google that. And that's how I ended up being interested in radical feminism, because by typing TERF, then I went onto all these radical feminist blogs and I was like, oh, okay, interesting. And I started to read the theory. I started reading about prostitution. It really changed my mind about everything, because even about prostitution, I was pretty unclear. I was following like what people would tell me, and I couldn't see straight, to be honest. And so now that's how I became a radical feminist, because trans activists started to harass me.
It's so interesting that they use this term and so many women find out about radical feminist ideas because they're just said something simple about believing in our bodies, or you can't change sex, and suddenly it's like a portal, this word. I know it's a slur, TERF, but it's also quite useful. So when was this? When did this happen to you?
I would say maybe 3 years ago, approximately. And so what they did in France is that they started to spot on Instagram every woman who had a little bit influence around feminism or sexuality, and they started explaining us how we should talk about ourselves. And a lot of women, I would say most women, sadly, started speaking, saying birthing people, menstruators. In France, it's very common in the Instagram sphere, and most women didn't resist because, I don't know, they felt bad for the trans people, they wanted to be inclusive, la la la. And because I was one of the only one being like, no, I don't want to, they started to be very, very obsessed with me because I wouldn't comply. And they were like, but why is she not complying? Like we need to like push her to comply. And that's how I started having more clear ideas, and that's how I became gender critical, because I kept reading. It kind of became an obsession for me too, because I was like, what's going on here? And I discovered how dangerous this ideology is for women. I started to understand what they're trying to do, changing words, and also making like sex disappear for the word gender. So I became aware of all that, and yeah, that's how it started.
Yeah, it's so amazing. It's very encouraging, actually. It's fantastic. I think that you could see that. Did you have doubts when they first called you a TERF, or were you quite sure of your own belief that you can't change sex?
No, I was like, they're ridiculous. I mean, for me, it was so obvious. I was like, it made no sense for me. I was, from the start, for me, what they were saying was just like a joke. I actually couldn't believe that they were trying to, like, I don't know. For me, I started to laugh when but what I don't find, I kind of find them sometimes funny and even intelligent, because they're so powerful and so organized, and they have such an amazing strategy to brainwash people like that. But what I don't understand, and I still don't understand, is how so many women fall in this trap. This is just, for me, it's just like, and at the end, it's really sad, because I thought that women were more ready to fight. And what I discovered is that so many women don't even see it, or like try to be so nice and so like have empathy all the time, that they're even ready to destroy themselves. So
yeah, I mean, I've read radical feminist ideas and been a radical feminist for a long time. So one of the things that links is the most a good explanation for me is something Mary Daly wrote, where she said that the imperative, the most important thing for every human being to do is to kill and destroy the female self. And that is true for men and women. So the men do it to the women, and we women are meant to do it to ourselves. So our first job is to kill the true female bit and to oppress ourselves and to be sort of plastic, just like they tried to do to you. They wanted you to be a puppet and kill yourself, your own ideas. And that rings true now, because I think that really is what a lot of women have done. They're saying, yeah, that we always did it, and we're going to carry on.
Yeah, and also what I think that a lot of women think is that what they feel, and a lot of women tell me that they think female is an insulting word. That's because now I say, sometimes I describe myself as a femalist. Why? Because it's the only, I think we should keep the word woman, but it's just to make a point when I do interviews and stuff, so I want people to understand what is my position compared to what people call feminists today, liberal feminists. So that's the only way I found a way to like try to express that I'm only fighting for females. But a lot of women on my female sexuality page, because I'm not as radical on this page, because it's a very mainstream page, and I want women to slowly understand, but surely I don't want to shock them. I have quite two different strategies on the accounts. But when I say that I consider myself a female, a lot of women are like, but female, it's an animal. So, and I'm not an animal. And they feel very insulted by the word. And I'm just trying to explain them that it just means that you have a different reproductive system and a different body, and that's about it. But for them, it's like they feel that if I say female, they're in a farm and they're just here to make kids or something like that.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that criticism of them. So I just want to ask another about this female-ism that Posey Parker, Kelly J. Keane, she's going to come on our webinar next week. So we'll be asking her a bit about her ideas. She sometimes talks about this female-ism as well. And I think she's using that same sort of focus on the female. And then, you know, she's made very famous the adult human female
Yeah.
T-shirts. Have you followed her work or seen her?
Yeah, I've been very inspired by her. It's because of the adult female T-shirt that I thought that, oh, okay, then I'm just gonna say I'm a female. It's just so much easier, and it's at least like that. It excludes everyone that doesn't have this body. So yeah, I know her, and I really like her.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so I'm going to go to the next question. So what is the situation right now in France regarding the transgender movement, and specifically the conversion therapy bill that we know that you're working on?
Yeah, I got so harassed with this. So there was a conversion therapy, there was a bill against conversion therapy, but it was supposed to be just for homosexual people, and I was completely fine with this. But last minute they arrived and they put in the law and gender identity, and I was like, what's that? And so I decided, because they cannot, like, when I started watching like the senators and the people at the government talking about that, they couldn't even define what was gender identity. It was so unclear. So I decided with my community to write to like people at at the government, and also people, senators. And I tried to ask them to like be more precise in this law, and I started to tell them that it might be dangerous, because being against conversion therapy for gender identity, what does it really mean? So it means that, for example, if you have a daughter, and let's imagine she's basically just like a lesbian girl, and she wants, and she believes she's a man. If you take her to a doctor or a psychologist or someone like that, and the doctor tries to tell her, look, you're actually not a man, and you will never be, even if you go through like a transition process, then it means it's conversion therapy to not let her transition. So it gets dangerous. So I tried to explain that. I even got like an appointment with like one of our minister, and she listened to that. I mean, she knows. That's the thing. They know. They actually know, but they don't want to. I don't know. What they told me is that yeah, we're listening, we know, and then they do nothing basically. And a lot of senators replied to me by insulting me, saying me I'm a transphobic person. And then I got in huge problems, because a lot of big LGBT pages on Instagram with millions and millions of followers, they made a post saying that I was against conversion therapy, not precising that it was for gender identity. So many people told me I was a homophobe, and even like huge pop stars in France starting to like repost. So it went really far, so far that my door at my own apartment was, someone tried to open it, and like they trashed my door. I don't know how they have my address. So it went like super far.
Yeah, it's horrifying, isn't it? Because I think the people who start these rumors know that it's not true. So they're trying to sort of, using this dishonesty, make it look as if you're right wing and homophobic, which you're not. But they sort of pretend that they misunderstand, or maybe whatever, and then it becomes a reality because it's being shared everywhere, and people start to really believe it, and particularly young people, I guess. Yeah. But so how have your followers sort of taken this? Do you think a lot of people understand what you're saying, or do they think possibly you are homophobic or whatever?
No, so I have my private community on my own name, Dora Moutot, on Instagram, and these people are all, I mean, they're basically gender critical because I keep talking about that all the time, and I think they're convinced. If they stay here, they're pretty convinced, or at least they understand why I'm saying this. But on my other account with 500,000 people, I would say that actually most people are, I would say that maybe 20,000 people left. That's approximately the number, but most people stayed, and most people are actually agree with me. They won't actually fight. They're not activists, but for them it just makes sense, and that's it. So I would say it's just like actually a small number of it's a small number of activists who are really against me and harassing me, and then it's a lot of teenagers at the end who don't think and who never thought about what is a woman actually.
Yeah. And what about the public opinion and the sort of law? Do you think it's moving in favor of transgender ideology at the moment, mostly?
Yeah. It's right now I think all the laws are pretty are going on this side, and I don't know why really, because it doesn't really make sense, but I think like the political class in France is not ready, and it's not like in the UK with Maya Forstater, etc., where it's moving. In France we're very, very late, and I think because there is not so much discussion about gender identity in the media. For now, we're just in this moment where there is transgender people everywhere on every advertisement, and they don't make a difference between being lesbian, gay, and trans. Like it's just like it's all the same thing, and they're trying to make it look cool and trendy and fashion, and they're making TV shows with transgenders, and it's just like very glamorous and very cool and very they kind of think it's mainstream and underground at the same time, so it makes them feel like cooler, but there is no actual discussion. And I'm trying to make a documentary about that in France, but it's so hard. Like all the channels, they don't want to hear about it because they have this inclusive policy. So yeah.
And I mean, I guess one of your big things that you sort of talk about, it being about female sexuality. I have this vision that I mean, maybe it's happened that we'll get men who say that they're women lecturing us that the type of sex we really love is anal sex. That's what women really love, and they're explaining how pleasurable it is to have anal sex, and that's what women love, and that's the sort of ultimate gaslighting, because they have different bodies, and men do apparently get pleasure from anal sex because they have a prostate, but we won't be allowed to say actually. But have you had examples of that on your when you talk about female sexuality, that there are men telling you how women should be?
One of the first problem I had is that with a friend of mine was an account called Gang du Clito. She was doing a campaign about clitoris. So we went out and we were putting clitoris all over Paris. And then we had this trans activist making like a campaign against us, saying that no, not all women have a clitoris. And so because not all women have a clitoris, we should not talk about it because that's not inclusive. And touching or clitoris is gross. I mean, he was like, he was ridiculous. And a lot of, so it's starting like that. But of course, for me, I've always been very interested in like sexual fetishes. And I've been younger, I've myself been in like some dark kind of like BDSM scene, and I've seen all the CC guys, and I've seen all this. That's also why I think I reacted very fast, because I know them. I know I know what are their perverted fantasies. I actually really know. It's weird because they're feminine, but it's almost they're clothes from the adult baby diapers lovers team, and they actually like to be little girls. It's not a woman that they want to be. It's like they have this little girl fetish, and they want to live the girly childhood they never had, but through sex, which is really a fucked up idea. But I mean, there's a lot of guys like that, and then they pretend they're trans at some point because I think their sexual fantasy takes over their life, and then suddenly they're trans.
Yeah. And is that quite a big scene in France then, the BDSM and the fetishes? It's growing, would you say?
It's growing a lot, and with Instagram account about female sexuality, a lot of women are making promotion of BDSM, polyamory, and queer. It's like a mashup of the three things, and I think it's terrible for women. And the problem is that when you try to talk about that, you're from the, I mean, you're a terrible person from the right, and you're a conservative, and
yeah. So you probably know about the books by Sheila Jeffries, though, and that she has a new book coming out called Penile Imperialism, which will really be focusing on the fetishes. And she co-wrote the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. So apart from being an expert in fetishes, she's an expert on women's human rights, international law. But that will be, we'll make sure that you know about that book when it comes out, because that sounds as if it's a big crossover of interest.
I think knowing BDSM or knowing porn, having a good idea of like male fetishes, it really helps you to see clear through like the trans spectrum, because I think a lot of people are trans for different reasons. But when I try to talk to women about like male fetish, they're so surprised because they're so naive, you know. And I'm like, just go on a fucking porn website and scroll and just go from one fetish to another, and you will understand what's going on in their head. And a lot of women, they don't consume this kind of stuff, so they cannot know.
Have you suffered a backlash? Have there been sort of, are you less popular now in with your followers?
Before, I used to have lots of like interviews. I would go talk to different media. They would invite me to do conference. I would also work with a lot of different brands. That's how I was paying my rent. And now it's really crazy. Like I would, per month, maybe I had like 20 requests from brands. Now it's so much lower, because all the brands around like sex toys, all the brands around like periods, all the brands are what I'm talking about basically are all trans friendly, and they know my position. So I and also most like left medias in France won't invite me anymore. So yeah.
Right. Okay. So we're now going to we're going to watch a video pre-recorded about the tickle versus giggle and women-only spaces.
So I'm just sitting here on my bed going to talk about all of this to myself, which is kind of therapeutic. So thank you for the opportunity. Basically, a trans-identified male named Roxy Tickle filed an Australian human rights complaint against Giggle and myself in January 2022, which led to the potential of a federal court case. What happened is in September last year, it would have been me. I don't remember it because, it's just another work day. So I have no recollection specifically about it, but I know it would have been me. I removed Roxy Tickle from the Giggle app. Now, the Giggle onboarding selfie, which is just to see if someone's male or female, is set at 94% accuracy. And it works exactly as you would expect 94% accuracy to work. And it's just that this is the most logical, simplest, easiest, least invasive way to create an online female-only space is just a selfie. I mean, we all take selfies constantly every day. There's nothing controversial about that. We're constantly judging photos of everybody in society. So saying, oh, that's male or that's female should be like the least controversial thing on the planet. When we were developing the app, not for a second did I think that this would be controversial in any way, shape, or form, but it is the most. And, you know, there are men who constantly try to see if they can get on. And I understand that just in terms of the fun of it or whatever. And we have it set to 94% to create a situation where we would rather remove a male than deny a female. Basically, yeah, so Roxanne Tickle did make it through the selfie. And created some profiles. And as soon as, like, I don't remember the specifics of the exact thing because I've seen other males. Like, so I just know from what I do in general. I'll see a picture of a male and go, oh, that's a male. Off you go. Get off. You know, what? Like, no other user or potential user of Giggle has ever contacted my personal / professional phone, but like my phone, just in general, like my phone number, I was just instantly freaked out by it because it's just instantly scary behavior. You know, my mind immediately went to like, oh, what kind of person am I dealing with here? Because then there was like some missed calls from them, and I was like, you know what this app is, and it's just going from, it's so inappropriate to call my phone, you know? And so I actually called my dad. So I didn't respond or anything, obviously. And I called my dad and I said, what do I do? And he said, block the number and don't tell your mother, because my mum gets very, very scared and a little bit hysterical about safety and things like that. So I didn't. And I blocked and I kind of just forgot about it. And then, you know, life happened, found out I was pregnant, all of that exciting stuff. And then in January of 2022, I was actually in isolation with COVID, 15 weeks pregnant, very, very sick. And I got an email from the Australian Human Rights Commission saying that a complaint had been made against Giggle and myself, which at first I thought it was sort of like this joke. At this point, I had been introduced to this person's reputation a little bit more, in the sense that in Australia, he has made complaints about other women, just to either their workplaces, women who advocate for women's rights. So there's a pattern emerging there. I immediately called the women in Australia who are involved in this and with legal backgrounds or legal expertise, and was like, what do I do? It was the start of responding to the Human Rights Commission complaint, which was accusing me of discriminating against somebody based on gender identity. And my argument for this was, and always has been, is that no, I'm actually not discriminating against trans women based on gender identity. Giggle is an app for females. And, you know, especially in Australia, we have the right of association, blah, blah, blah. So you can have something like that. It's not like, it's like Giggle is for females plus like cis men, and the only people who can't come on the app are males with a trans identity or the gender identity. Then you'd be like, oh, that's like, that seems odd. It's just for females. It's based on biological sex. So if you're male, you're male. Your gender identity is completely irrelevant to me. Like if you're female, your gender identity is irrelevant. And on Giggle, we actually have categories for gender identity for females who are exploring that. And it's actually a beautiful community developing in Giggle support in gender identity, because there are women who live in countries where gender nonconformity is very much frowned upon, as being polite about it, but there is what you could basically say a phobia about that, and they are treated horribly in society. And so being able to talk with other women who are going through this, or who can offer advice or empowerment, all different things, is, I think, a really positive thing to happen. So there's no gender identity discriminations. And so we responded like this to the Australian Human Rights Commission, also then saying, you know, Roxy Tickle had called my phone, which he had detailed in the human rights complaint, but he positioned it as being reasonable in terms of, like, he'd done all the reasonable means to try and get access to the app, and so he was left with no other option than to do a human rights complaint. And I was like, no, you absolutely terrified me, because I thought, what's next? You're going to turn up at my house. So just completely different perceptions of behaviour there. So we told the Australian Human Rights Commission of this. There was also, the legal team had found, by doing a search on Twitter, I blocked Roxy Tickle on Twitter, not knowing it was Roxy Tickle. So we got the complaint on the 20th of January. On the 24th of January, he was claiming that he was on the app and that Giggle had been hacked, which that hadn't happened. And so he was sort of saying really, sort of defamatory things about the platform and claiming he was on it. So it was like, well, what's the truth here? Now I know that he's not on it. But the Australian Human Rights Commission did not accept any of our arguments, didn't really acknowledge them. They just said there's a case to be had here, basically. And so I could go, the goal of the Australian Human Rights Commission is I could go and have what's called conciliation. And so I'd sit in a room with like a conciliator and Roxy Tickle and apparently be told to explain why I don't think that Roxy Tickle or trans women are women. And we were told that to resolve it, we would have to let trans-identified males on the app. I would have to, both Giggle and myself would have to go to gender identity education, and that we'd have to apologize, I think. Oh, and also that we'd have to moderate how women speak on Giggle Talk, so not to offend trans women. So I said no to conciliation, knowing that the Human Rights Commission would potentially advise Roxy to go to federal court, or could say, look, there's actually no case here, so move on. But the Australian Human Rights Commission did advise to go to federal court, and so there was 60 days to file. I waited until 5 p.m. on the 61st day, thinking it was done, and it wasn't. I announced that, we got out of this, it didn't happen, and then a week later we got served with the papers that had been filed with 2.5 hours to spare. And the federal court case was alleging unlawful discrimination, again against Giggle and myself personally. The thing that was the craziest in it, I was referred to as the second respondent, and that they said that I've referred to I was in breach of something because I'd referred to trans women, including the applicant, as male. And so it's just so crazy to get a lawsuit where they're trying to punish you for telling the truth. It's psychologically harmful, yes, but it's so confusing that you feel like you're upside down. You're just going what world am I living in? When federal court would actually send a document saying that I'm in breach of something for saying the truth. I was saying to our barrister, do I have to lie under oath? What's expected of me here? Because trans women are male. It's actually the only prerequisite. I can't be a trans woman. That's just how it is. This is just madness. So basically we had 28 days to respond when we got this. And at the time I was 27 days away from giving birth. I'm now 2 days away. And so we were putting everything together to respond. The legal team was brilliant and at work. And then on Monday we got notice that the case had been withdrawn. We have no information as to why that is, so all we can go by is assumptions. My assumption ultimately is that I think we would win in court, and we would be able to protect female-only spaces Australia-wide from any kind of treatment like this. And that's not in the best interest of the transactivism lobby. It is much better to keep the law as obscure and as it is right now. It's very muddled and trying to intimidate women with it. But at the same time, I hope that women in Australia and in other places have seen, while it's been traumatic and stressful standing up to this, if you stand up to them, they'll back down. They just will, because they don't expect you to. They're quite used to, because they were doing this in silence for a while, and women businesses and things were just sort of giving into them out of fear, because no one likes being called a bigot or a transphobe or discriminatory or anything like that. It's horrible, especially when you know you're not that kind of person. But when we are all getting educated on this and understanding that being called that doesn't mean you are anymore. Yeah, hopefully it just inspires women to go, no, I'm going to stand up to it as well. And sure, the more women who do it, the shorter the time of the punishment as the process will be. Eventually, we'll all just have stood up to it, and will have drowned it out. What we've experienced this week is a huge win. We didn't have to go to court for it. In Australia, because of the Sex Discrimination Act and the gender identity clause in it, it's still, one would argue, a little bit muddled. It's there to be scrutinised. And in the event that we're sort of called on to fight it again, we will. I'll always fight for it. I'm not going to back down now. But at the same time, right at this very moment, I'm going to enjoy having a baby. Hopefully she's out soon because I'm going out of my mind. Yeah, and enjoy and celebrate female-only spaces and grow our little startup into something that we've always had a vision for, that for the last 2.5 years we've had to be so stunted by all of this because, we sort of get cancelled as a company out of the gate because we were doing something purely for women. We've been, investment firms won't work with us in Australia. Marketing firms won't work with us. So you just sort of left to your own devices, and creating a startup is difficult for anyone, for any startup. If these were easy, everyone would do them. But this has been particularly difficult, but we're in a really good position right now, and we're just so excited for the next phases. So thank you so much for letting me vent all of this. Hopefully I wasn't too boring and sort of gave some kind of insight into the whole process. And yeah, again, all I can say, if you find yourself in a position where you're being bullied by these activists, stand your ground.